G-Bumpy 2000. Back with more of Slappy's Nightmare. We're going to pick up right where we left off last time. Let's get into it. Chapter 21. Georgia opened the front door. A hard rain pounded the front stoop. Thunder rumbled across the night sky. Rainwater splashed from a clogged gutter at the front of the house. "We'll make a dash for it, Slappy," Georgia said, sheltering him under her yellow plastic rain poncho. "It's right across the street." She took off running down the front lawn, her shoes squishing in the wet mud, kicking up waves of water. "What a storm!" she cried, as a roar of thunder seemed to shake the ground. She jogged onto the front stoop of the small brick house across the street and rang the bell. "Hurry, Mrs. Warren! I'm totally drenched already." The door swung open. A pleasant-looking young woman, already in a raincoat and hat, greeted Georgia warmly. "Just dropped the wet stuff in the closet here. Thanks for coming at such a short notice, Georgia. Robbie has been looking forward to seeing you." Georgia shrugged off the plastic poncho and shoved it into the front closet. She shivered. She turned, adjusting Slappy's jacket. "What's that? A new puppet?" Mrs. Warren asked. "I thought Robbie might enjoy meeting Slappy," Georgia said, brushing drops of rain from Slappy's painted eyebrows. Mrs. Warren frowned. "Maybe, but you know Robbie. He's so timid. He might be afraid." "I'll be careful," Georgia promised. "Oh, wonderful," Slappy thought unhappily. "We're babysitting a wimp. I thought maybe I could do a good deed by entertaining the kid, but if the little geek's afraid of me, I'm wasting my time here." Time. Slappy glanced at the clock on the mantel. Time was ticking by. Jimmy O. James' curse was never out of Slappy's thoughts. 3 good deeds to stay alive. But how? The Warrens hurried out, promising to come home early. Georgia carried Slappy into the den where 2-year-old Robbie was down on the floor playing with a pile of superhero action figures. "Hi, Robbie. Look what I brought," Georgia announced, raising Slappy in front of her. Robbie, chucked and pink-skinned. Robbie, chubby and pink-skinned, with a round baby face and soft, wavy brown hair, raised his eyes to Slappy. He wore a long-sleeved red shirt under blue Oshkosh overalls and was barefoot because he'd kicked off his socks. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at Slappy. "I'll show you," Georgia replied. She sat Slappy down on the floor and slid her hand into his back to the controls. "Hi, Robbie," she made Slappy say, clicking his mouth up and down. "My name is Slappy." Robbie's expression changed. His chin trembled and his face reddened. "I don't like him," he wailed. He banged an action figure down on the linoleum floor. "I don't like him." "No, wait," Georgia pleaded. "Slappy is funny, Robbie. Slappy likes you." "I like you, Robbie," she made the dummy say. "You're a good boy." "Put him away," the little boy screamed, his face darkening even deeper. "I don't like him. I don't like him. He's scowy." "Okay," Georgia agreed reluctantly. She picked up Slappy. "But don't you want to touch him, Robbie? You could play with him if you want." "No!" Robbie screeched, pounding the action figure on the floor. "I don't like him." Okay, Georgia carried Slappy out of the den and dropped him onto an armchair in the living room, then hurried back to play with Robbie. Gazing at the mantelpiece clock, Slappy listened to them in the other room. Robbie didn't want to play any games, Georgia suggested. He didn't want to watch a cartoon video. He wanted a snack, but he didn't like anything Georgia offered him. At 8 o'clock, Georgia started trying to get Robbie to go to bed, but he kept insisting he had to stay up until his parents returned. What a whining little jerk, Slappy thought bitterly. He could hear Georgia growing more and more impatient with the kid. "You're acting like this because you're sleepy," she told Robbie. "Come on, let me tuck you in. and I'll read you a funny story." "I don't like stories," Robbie declared angrily. "Oh, what am I going to do?" Slappy asked himself, sighing, watching the second hand on the clock ticking off the seconds. "I'm just lying here, watching my life pass before my eyes. How could this be happening to me?" It was after 9:30 when Georgia finally got Robbie tucked in. She returned from his room, sighing wearily. She passed Slappy without glancing at him. He could see her plop into a chair in the den. He heard the TV go on. Georgia began flipping from channel to channel. Finally, she landed on one show. Slappy listened to the drone of voices from the TV. The clock seemed to tick louder. The sound thundered in Slappy's ears. At a little after 10 o'clock, he heard a high wail from down the hall. "Robbie!" Crying. Slappy watched the den doorway, expecting Georgia to come hurrying out, expecting Georgia to go see why the baby was crying. The voices on the TV droned out. Robbie's wails grew louder, more frantic. No sign of Georgia. She didn't move from her chair. Robbie's cries rose and fell like an ambulance siren. Something is terribly wrong, Slappy decided. Why isn't Georgia doing anything? He slid off the couch and tiptoed to the den. She's asleep, he realized. Georgia had fallen asleep in the armchair. The TV remote clicker grasped tightly in her hand. Robbie's frantic cries rang in Slappy's ears. Is this my chance, he wondered. My chance to do a good deed. He spun away from the den and hurried down the hall to Robbie's room. What was going on in there? Chapter 22. Slappy stopped at the door to Robbie's room and peered in. The boy's screams were shrill and interrupted by coughs and choking sounds. His little hands flailed wildly behind the crib bars. Slappy saw immediately what the problem was. Robbie's blanket had become tangled around his neck. The blanket was choking him. Serves you right, you little freak. That was Slappy's first thought. His second thought was that he had finally had a chance to do a good deed. He shuffled quickly up to the crib, reached inside, and loosened the light wool baby blanket. Then he gently pulled the blanket out from under Robbie. The little boy stopped his howls. He snuffled a bit and then shut his eyes and began to drift back to sleep. Slappy carefully covered him with the blanket. You're okay now, he whispered soothingly. You're a good boy. You're okay. Go back to sleep, he whispered into the crib until Robbie was sleeping soundly, comfortably. Then Slappy tiptoed out and returned to the chair in the living room. 1 down, 2 to go, Slappy thought, feeling pleased with himself. That was an easy one. I think I can do this. I think I can beat this stupid curse that ventriloquist put on me. And when I do, Jimmy O. James had better watch out. I'll track him down, and I really will pull off his head. It's the least I can do to pay him back for this nightmare he's putting me through. Gazing at the ticking clock, Slappy drifted off to sleep. He was startled awake a few minutes later by sounds and voices all around. The front door swung open. Mr. and Mrs. Warren hurried in, shaking off rainwater, both talking at once. The TV droned on in the den. Slappy heard George's voice. She had awakened and was talking to someone on the phone. And over all of these sounds, Slappy heard a high wail. Robbie, screaming at the top of his lungs, crying and shrieking. What's happening? Mrs. Warren cried, tossing off her raincoat. Georgia dropped the phone and came running into the living room. He just started crying, she stammered. He was perfectly quiet. Really? Georgia and the Warrens went running down the hall to Robbie's room. Robbie, are you okay? Mrs. Warren called breathlessly. Mommy and Daddy are home. Robbie's wails grew even louder. And then, from his chair in the living room, Slappy heard Georgia and the Warrens utter screams of horror. Chapter 23. What happened? Slappy jumped off the chair. He had to see. When I left the kid, he was sleeping peacefully. He took a few steps towards the hall. He could hear Mr. and Mrs. Warren screaming furiously at Georgia. You hung him in the drapes? Mrs. Warren shrieked. Are you crazy? I I didn't, Georgia protested weakly. Then how did Robbie get up there? Mrs. Warren demanded. Someone tied him to the drapes. He didn't climb up there by himself. Are you crazy? Mrs. Warren repeated. Tie a baby to the drapes. Are you insane? No, listen to me, George's voice broke. I don't understand it. I just put him to bed. Call her mother, Mrs. Warren shrieked to her husband. No, call the police. This girl has to be locked up. Slappy stood in the middle of the living room listening, thinking hard. Georgia didn't tie Robbie to the drapes. That's ridiculous, he knew. And I didn't tie up the little creep either. So it had to be someone else. And as Slappy had that thought, he heard Mrs. Warren declare, What are these footprints? Look, muddy footprints. Someone else must have come into the house, Georgia stammered in a trembling voice. Huh? Someone in the house, Mrs. Warren cried. Someone in the house. And you didn't know it? Slappy heard their footsteps. They were all making their way to the living room now. He dove back onto the chair and went limp just as they appeared. Mrs. Warren held Robbie in her arms, soothing him, petting his hair with one hand. The boy snuffled quietly and sucked his thumb, but he seemed to be okay. I must have fallen asleep for a few minutes, Georgia told him. I'm so sorry. I guess someone sneaked into the house while I was asleep. But who? Mrs. Warren started. Why? This doesn't make any sense, her husband muttered, shaking his head. He turned to Georgia. You'd better leave. But, Georgia started to protest. Just get your coat and leave, Mr. Warren ordered. Please. Go. Georgia started to the coat closet. You gonna call my mom? She asked timidly. I don't know, Mr. Warren snapped. I don't know what to do about this. At least Robbie's okay. He'll have nightmares for weeks, Mrs. Warren moaned, still petting the little boy's hair. I am so sorry, Georgia murmured, tears glistening in her eyes. I don't know what else to say. I'm just so sorry. She pulled on her rain poncho, grabbed Slappy off the chair, and ran out of the house. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. A cold breeze shook the trees. Who did it? Georgia cried, tears running down her face as she made her way down the Warrens' front path. Who? Slappy had a pretty good idea. He could see the footprints in the wet ground going around to the side of the house. Little footprints. Stella's footprints. Well, it's time to put the bookmark back in the book because that's enough for this time. Maybe next time we can read a few more chapters of Slappy's Nightmare and see who's really doing all of this to Georgia. Is it Stella? Is it Slappy? We're going to find out. I'm going to stop recording now.